Last week, guys, pre-season testing came to a close and we found out a bit about the teams going into 2025, but still not a whole lot. But we do have some data to go through from pre-season testing, and in this video, I'm going to try and make out what we can from pre-season testing in terms of interpreting the data and coming away from testing, just looking at how certain teams conducted their programs and how the confident they sound or are looking coming out of testing, and how I will interpret that into what I think the pecking order is right now and what I think the pecking order will be in the first 3 Grand Prix of the season, where we are going to be going to tracks which are not the same as the track we were testing at in Bahrain. For a Formula 1 season that promises much, and by looking at testing, there is still a lot of promise there. Things still look pretty close between the top teams and especially the midfield. But before I properly get into things, guys, make sure to smash the like button on this video. Of course, does help the channel grow. But let me know in the comments section, what is your pecking order going into the season? And how do you think that will evolve as the season goes on? But let's just get right into it and start with some stats. And we'll start with the best lap times by team in Bahrain. Williams ended up with the best time from pre-season testing, a 1:29.3 by Carlos Sainz. Ferrari were not that much slower, only 0.03 of a second slower than Williams, with Mercedes and Red Bull not too far behind. Then you have McLaren almost half a second back from Red Bull and Mercedes. McLaren had a very interesting pre-season test. They were pushing quite hard relative to the other teams on day one, but for the rest of the test, they decided to really focus on the long runs and sound very confident about what they've got. And by looking at some of the data from those long runs, they have a lot of good reason to be as confident as they are. Then after that, you've got Alpine, just about slower than McLaren, with Aston Martin a couple tenths of a second back, and then Racing Bulls and Haas and Sauber the slowest, which is no surprise. In terms of the total mileage by team, Mercedes just about ending up as the best team in that regard, ahead of Haas and Racing Bulls, with Alpine quite impressive in 4th. Then you've got Williams, Ferrari, McLaren, Sauber, with Aston Martin and Red Bull not doing as much as maybe we would have expected, especially for Red Bull. But really, there wasn't that many reliability gremlins for the teams during testing compared to other years. So in general, everyone got enough miles in to know what their car is going to be like, at least to start the season. Now what we're going to do is go through the teams in order of last year's Constructors' Championship standings from the back to the front, and just get into how their test went and where I think they're at coming into the first Grand Prix of Melbourne for next week. Last in the championship last year, Sauber are most likely going to finish there this year as well. They were decent with their running at times during testing, but their car did not really look that much better than what we saw last year. And looking at the lap times, I don't think Sauber were necessarily sandbagging a lot more than other midfield teams, because there wouldn't really have been any real reason to for the Sauber team. So yeah, I think they are pretty much the slowest team, and I don't think that is really going to change over the course of the season, because of course next year, whole new set of regulations, they'll become the Audi Formula 1 team, and Audi will benefit if Sauber finish last in the championship this year, because they'll have even more time in the wind tunnel to develop their car next year. So there's not really any incentive for Sauber to actually be good in 2025. Next up is Williams Racing, who come out of pre-season testing looking like most probably the quickest midfield team. Whether that actually will be the case once we get to Melbourne, we'll have to see. But they were easily the most impressive team in testing. They were immediately quick out of the blocks, and then Carlos Sainz set the best time of testing on day 2, which was almost 1 second quicker than what Williams did at the same track a year ago. So clearly they've massively improved the car. There is no doubt about that. So even if it's not the quickest midfield car, it's going to be pretty damn close to being that. But at the moment, I would say outside of the top 4 teams, the front-running teams, I think Williams do have the 5th best car, at least to start the season at most tracks. The only thing that has me slightly concerned about Williams is maybe they did push very hard just to try and do some headline lap times, maybe to get some new sponsors on board. It is possible that they were doing that. I don't think there's a great chance necessarily they were doing that, but I do think that it is a possibility for this team. But most likely, I think they obviously were pushing harder than, say, Ferrari, McLaren and Red Bull and Mercedes. There's no way Williams are going to be on pole position in Melbourne. But I think definitely they've got a pretty fast car for 2025. And they should be right in the top 10, at least with one of their drivers next week in Melbourne. 8th in the championship last year, Racing Bulls obviously had a disappointing end to 2024, and as expected, it looks like they are not really going to change that form going through to the first bit of 2025. Their car did not look very impressive in testing. There were a couple moments where the car was a bit unstable through corners where it should have been a lot more stable. For example, on the exit of turn 2 and 3, with Isaac Hadjar at the wheel for Racing Bulls. But yeah, looking at the lap times and just looking at the handling of the car, it doesn't look like a car that's going to be really fighting for points, especially early in the season. I think eventually they will start fighting for points later on in the season, but for the first few races, I think consistently they'll be outside of the top 10. Haas F1, kind of like last year's testing, they didn't really show us a whole lot in terms of what they truly have. The first 2 days of testing, they were not bothering at all with the shorter runs. They did on day 3 show us a bit more, but it still wasn't really enough, and definitely wasn't maybe as good as maybe what we were expecting, given that at the end of last year, they arguably had the fastest midfield car. I think they will be a bit quicker than they showed in testing, at least on the final day. I'm not saying they're going to be in the top 10 at the first Grand Prix or the first couple Grand Prix, but I think they'll be definitely in the mix to maybe get a car in the top 10 in the first Grand Prix. But I think definitely they are a bit more on the back foot compared to the end of last year, and they're going to need a big upgrade probably by the time we get to the European season, say around the Emilia-Romagna Grand Prix at Imola. Probably going to need a big upgrade then to really get themselves into a position where they're consistently scoring points, because Williams, Alpine and probably Aston Martin, I would say at the moment, look quicker than them. Talking of Alpine, let's go on to them. They initially didn't look that great in testing, but then as day 2 and day 3 came, they showed a lot more pace and in general looked about as good as they were at the end of last year. I don't think they're going to be anywhere near, of course, the front-running teams, but they should be in Melbourne and really for the first few races, not with both cars because it will be very competitive in that midfield pack, and I think obviously Pierre Gasly is a lot more reliable for that team than Jack Doohan. I think at least with one of their cars, they will be definitely fighting for points and getting into Q3 a few times to start the season. But whether Alpine have got the best car in the midfield is something we'll have to find out once we get into the first couple races. I think in Melbourne, probably not, given the track layout. Wouldn't be surprised, though, in Shanghai if they did have the strongest car in the midfield, given that track should suit their car's strengths and just characteristics a bit more than it said, I think, would for Williams. So we'll see how things go, but Alpine really should maintain the form they had at the end of last season, especially with Pierre Gasly at the wheel, who had a very good end to 2024. Aston Martin are not looking that great, I have to say, coming out of testing. They're not looking terrible in regards to the midfield. They are definitely going to be in the fight for points and Q3 appearances and stuff like that. But they are not in a position like last year where they were clearly the fifth best team on the grid and were quite comfortably ahead of the other midfield runners. That is not the case this year. They look to be about where they were at the very end of last year, where Alonso could finish in the top 10 but could not finish at the front of the midfield pack. That is pretty much where Aston Martin are at. Adrian Newey, of course, has just started at Aston Martin, but he's going to be pretty much working entirely on the 2026 car, so that's not really going to help Aston Martin in 2025. But to start the season, yeah, I think they'll be about as good as they were at the end of last year. Just don't expect anything amazing from Alonso in a car that looks pretty standard, I would say. Now on to the front-running teams, and Mercedes-Benz will start off with, and they came out of testing looking pretty decent, and you may say, for the Formula One season ahead, are the dark horses for this season, given how on the long runs their car looked very good, and even on the shorter field runs looked better, I would say, than they were in 2024, where that did tend most of the time to be a weakness for Mercedes, where in the races they were a bit better and a bit closer to these other front-running teams on a more regular basis, but in qualifying were just giving up still too much lap time. But again, coming out of testing, they look closer on the quali runs, and in the race runs look like they've got about the same pace as teams like McLaren and Ferrari. Maybe in certain conditions you could argue they are quicker than those teams, but it will all depend. If they do have that type of race pace, it will all depend on what can they do over a qualifying lap as to whether they can truly get the potential out of their car on race day. Not in terms of the pace, but utilising maybe that great pace into getting, obviously, a great result. Because if you've got great race pace, you need really good grid position to really deliver the result that your pace deserves, if that makes any sense. But for now, I'm going to say, at least over a single lap, I think Mercedes are the slowest just about of the front-running teams. But in the race runs, Mercedes, I think you could argue, have maybe one of the best cars on the grid. I think really, though, we're going to have to wait until the first couple Grand Prix to be able to actually say that, because we don't have enough data to absolutely say that, yes, Mercedes, over a race distance, have got one of, if not maybe, just about the best car. So we'll have to wait until the first couple Grand Prix. But they are definitely right in the mix, and you cannot say at the moment that they're definitely not going to be in the championship battle, because if they do prove to have a very quick car on race day, of course, race day is mostly where the points are scored, that really could see Mercedes right in the fight with a pretty strong driver lineup. Red Bull Racing had a bit of a weird pre-season test. Obviously, they didn't do the most laps, did the least amount of laps out of any team. Still a decent amount. They had a couple, I think, reliability gremlins, small reliability gremlins through pre-season testing. But it wasn't really until the final couple hours of testing where they actually started to show us a bit more of the pace that they probably do have for at least the start of 2025. And over a single lap, it doesn't look that great, I have to be honest. I think right now, over a single lap, they are definitely slower than McLaren, and around particular circuits, probably slower than Ferrari. But I think when it comes to the races and the race runs, are probably better than Ferrari and closer to McLaren than they are over a single lap. How they are relative to Mercedes, though, Not quite sure. We'll have to see again in the first couple Grand Prix. But Red Bull, I don't think there's any reason necessarily to panic. They've definitely not got the best car to start the season. I think there's no doubt about that. But I think it's still good enough to win races early on. But it will be very close and a very tight battle between them, McLaren, Mercedes, and probably Ferrari as well, because it is just that close between the top 4 teams. As long as the car in the first few races is close enough to fight for pole and clearly close enough to fight for the race win, then Max Verstappen, of course, has great chances to keep winning races and help, obviously, his championship bid for 2025. But in Melbourne, whether Max is going to have maybe a good enough grid position to win the race, we'll have to see, because again, it's going to be so close in qualifying that one slight error might be the difference between winning the race on Sunday and coming maybe third. So with Red Bull, they're right in the mix, but definitely not the quickest. And I think with Ferrari, you could probably say the same. They've got a very good car, it looks like, over a single lap. Not so much over the long runs. It looks like arguably Ferrari have the slowest car over the long runs. But because of how quick they do appear to be over the shorter runs, they're going to be right in the fight also for pole position and, of course, the race win. Especially at Melbourne, a track that should suit their car pretty well given how high speed it is. And remember, of course, Ferrari do have the strongest power unit on the grid in terms of raw power. So it's going to be very close, but I think at the moment, Ferrari clearly have shown the biggest weakness out of any of the front-running teams. And what I mean by that is if you look at the other front-running teams, McLaren don't appear at the moment to have a real weakness. Red Bull aren't the quickest, but I wouldn't say necessarily have like a clear weakness. And the same really for Mercedes. But with Ferrari, again, over a single lap, they look good. But over the race runs, there looks to be, at the moment, a clear deficit. And when Lewis Hamilton on the final day of testing came out and said, there's work to do, I think that is partly what he's saying, is that especially with the race runs, even though, yes, they are quick on a single lap, there is still work to do to make sure they're quick enough actually when it matters to deliver the result on race day. But also, another reason why I think Lewis said Ferrari have got work to do is because I think in general, Ferrari are not as quick at this point of the season as they hoped to be. Maybe Ferrari were hoping to be just about the quickest team at the start of this year, but that does not appear to be the case. They will be quick enough to fight for pole in the opening few races, but winning any of the first few races, given what we've seen so far, might actually prove to be quite difficult. And I think part of what Lewis is saying in that the Ferrari have got work to do is not just, improving the pace of the car with more fuel on board, but I think also they're going to need a big upgrade early in the season to really get them firing on all cylinders for 2025. Because maybe not over a single lap, but definitely over the race runs, I would quite comfortably say right now McLaren are quicker by a decent amount than Ferrari are. And if that remains the case for pretty much the whole season, then of course Ferrari are not going to win the championship at all, because McLaren have got a very strong driver lineup and have got obviously a very good car. So Ferrari, it feels like out of the front 4 teams, if you were to ask me who already looks like they need a big upgrade, say by the time we get to the start of the European season, I think quite clearly Ferrari are that team. But don't panic, Ferrari fans. Of course, there are plenty of races to go in this season. Obviously, we haven't started the season yet. And Ferrari might be quite a bit quicker in the races than I actually think they are right now when we actually get to racing in Melbourne. But right now, I don't think Ferrari are in a great position, to be honest. But for the Constructors' Champions coming into this year, McLaren, they look as good as they were at the end of last year. If not, to be honest, a bit better than they were at the end of last year. Because even though they were getting poles and winning the odd race, they were still very competitive and close with other teams like Ferrari, like Red Bull with Verstappen. And when Mercedes, finally had a decent car, they were in there as well. But at the minute, McLaren, I wouldn't say have a car that is clearly by a comfortable margin the quickest. In Melbourne, for example, I think it will be pretty close between them, Ferrari and Red Bull for pole. But I think at certain tracks, they are going to have the clear quickest car. For example, at the second Grand Prix of the season, I wouldn't be surprised if McLaren dominate that Grand Prix weekend because the track will suit their car. And right now, aerodynamically speaking, McLaren, I think, have got, by at least a couple tenths of a second, the best car on the grid. So McLaren are the team to beat, I think, to start 2025. Again, whether that will be the case for the whole season, who knows? I don't think they're going to win every race between, say, now and when we get to Imola in mid-May for the European season. Max will win a Grand Prix or two, I'm sure, and maybe even Mercedes will win a couple Grand Prix. So don't think I'm saying McLaren are going to absolutely dominate the start of the season, because I don't think that's going to be the case. But I do think, in terms of overall pace in clean air, I think McLaren have got the best car right now, and I don't think that is a controversial opinion whatsoever. And I think most F1 journalists and analysts probably would say the same at this point. But what do I think the pecking order is coming out of Bahrain? Well, let's show it on screen, and I will also show what I think the pecking order will be for the first three Grand Prix. Because, of course, first three Grand Prix tracks are Albert Park in Melbourne, the Shanghai International Circuit in China, and then the Suzuka Circuit, of course, in Japan. And the pecking order is not obviously going to be the exact same from what it is now coming out of the Bahrain test, because, of course, the Bahrain International Circuit, in terms of characteristics, is quite a bit different from the three tracks we're starting the season at. But coming out of testing, I would say McLaren over a single lap. This pecking order is, by the way, because it is a lot harder to determine over a race distance. But McLaren, over a single lap, I think have got the best car. Ferrari, I would go just about in second, with Red Bull third and Mercedes fourth. The top four, over a single lap, I would say are covered by, around a track like Bahrain, I think are covered by probably 4 to maybe 5 tenths of a second at the most. Then in fifth, I'm going Williams. I do believe they've got the strongest midfield car, at least around a track like Bahrain. Alpine then in sixth, Aston Martin seventh, Haas just behind in eighth, Racing Bulls ninth, and Sauber in 10th. And that is what I think the pecking order over a single lap will be also in Melbourne. Melbourne has a lot more high-speed corners, but is also very much a power track, given its redesign that it had a couple years ago. And obviously Bahrain, a power track as well. So I don't think we're going to see necessarily massive changes or alterations in the pecking order from what we saw in testing to the first Grand Prix in Melbourne. McLaren, I actually think, will be quicker in Melbourne than they look to be in testing. Red Bull and Mercedes also, I think, will be closer to Ferrari over a single lap in Melbourne than they look to be in Bahrain. Williams and Alpine and Aston Martin, I think, will be very close at the front of the midfield in Melbourne. Haas also will be in there. And then I think Racing Bulls and Sauber will be pretty comfortably the two slowest teams in Melbourne. But then we come to the Chinese Grand Prix, and the Shanghai International Circuit is a high aero circuit. And it's the first high aero circuit that we are going to in the season. Obviously, it's only a week after the Australian Grand Prix. And that this Grand Prix is where I think McLaren will pretty much dominate, because I think they've got, in an aerodynamic sense, clearly the best car. So I think they'll be clearly ahead of the rest of the field. Red Bull, I think, will be in second. Mercedes, very close to Red Bull in third. Again, this is the pecking order over a single lap. Ferrari, I think will drop to 4th best team at this circuit. And this is really, I think this Grand Prix is going to really emphasize the areas they need to work on. 5th, then I think will be Alpine, because I think they will be very strong around this type of circuit. 6th, I'm going Aston Martin, but Williams in 7th, I think they'll be very close with Aston Martin, so it'll be a good fight between those teams to get in the top 10. Racing Bulls, I think, will be a slight bit better in China. Haas, I'm going to go in 9th, and Sauber in 10th. And then the pecking order for Japan, which is high-speed corners, obviously, for the first sector, and then long stretches of acceleration zones, pretty much for the second half of the lap. Pretty high-speed circuit. McLaren, once again, I think will have the fastest car, with Red Bull not a million miles behind, but I think definitely will have the second best car over a single lap, with Ferrari in 3rd, a bit better than Shanghai. I think Suzuka will definitely suit their car a tad better, with Mercedes 4th, and then Alpine, I think, will be 5th, with Williams 6th, Aston 7th, Haas 8th, Racing Bulls 9th, Sauber 10th. And then the pecking order for Bahrain maybe will be the same as it is now, but by then we will maybe get a couple upgrades for the teams that might change things. So we might see a couple teams improve quite a bit between now and then. Remember, the Bahrain Grand Prix is about 5 or so weeks away. So there is time for the teams to improve between now and that Grand Prix. But for the first 3 Grand Prix, that's what I think the pecking order will be. I could be massively wrong. I hope I am, and I hope it is all over the place. But that's what I think it should probably be from what we've seen in pre-season testing in Bahrain. But as for what this means for the Formula 1 season, because of course it is a very long season, you'll have to find out my thoughts on that next week. Because next week, before the Australian Grand Prix, I will be uploading my final season predictions for 2025. And I invite you along to make your final predictions for 2025. And we will see who will be wrong or correct with their predictions. And of course, it's going to be a long season where, even though what I've just said for the pecking order is, what I think to start the season, it could be very much different once we get to Abu Dhabi in December. And I'm sure it's going to be an absolutely fantastic Formula 1 season ahead. But guys, thanks for coming along to this pre-season testing review. Been great to have you along. Make sure again to let me know your thoughts in the comments as to what do you think the pecking order is going into Melbourne, and do you think certain teams will struggle at certain tracks we're beginning the season with? Let me know in the comments section down below. And like I said, save your final predictions for that final predictions video that I'll upload, hopefully at least a couple days before the Australian Grand Prix weekend. But guys, until that video, and until next weekend's Australian Grand Prix, which of course I'll be covering quite a bit on the channel, it has been me, Chazza HD. Goodbye.